everyone, today we're talking about another check on Parliament by the Australian Constitution, and this is known as the separation of powers, which includes the legislative, executive and judicial powers of Australia. Now, do not get this confused with division of powers. Separation of powers is what we're looking at today. Okay, so if we look at study design, you can see that there are 5 checks that that the Constitution provides on the Parliament's lawmaking ability. We've just done bicameral, and now we're looking at the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers in Australia, or the main bodies in Australia that administer, enforce, and create laws. Okay, so what is the separation of powers? Well, the Constitution says that there are 3 main bodies of power in Australia, and those are the executive power, which is the power to administer the laws. This is held by the Governor-General, but more in practice is actually held by our Prime Ministers and our senior ministers. Those are the ministers that have particular roles in the Cabinet, such as Minister for Health, Minister for Education, Minister for Defence, and the government departments that they oversee or head. Then we have legislative power, which is the power to make the laws. So we know that we have a bicameral system, and within that we have the House of Reps, who usually introduces the laws, and the Senate, who checks those laws before they're passed into legislation, so a bill to legislation. The third area is judicial power, which is the power to apply and interpret the laws and also enforce those laws. And deem anything that's unconstitutional as invalid. This is vested in the High Court at the highest place, which checks on whether things are unconstitutional, but also the other courts within Australia. So we have 3 areas or 3 bodies that are separated, and their aim is to check on one another. But I'm going to give you a little analogy here to try and remember the difference. Don't use this in your exam, but it's good to kind of understand the difference. So here we go. The government of the day decides to legislate in the Senate and the House of Reps that there is going to be a mandated vaccine for COVID, for example. Okay, so they've made a law that says everyone must have a vaccine for COVID. It's passed through the House of Reps and the Senate, and it's been signed off by the Governor-General, and it's become law. But what happens then? Well, how do we ensure that people are actually getting vaccinated? Well, that's the job for the executive power. Okay, so the executive power is the power to administer the laws once they've been passed. And administration means the organisation. So how do we ensure that we've got enough vaccines for everyone, that people know where to go? Is there some sort of media campaign so people know that they're supposed to be getting vaccinated? How do we ensure that there's enough nurses, for example? So it's really about the organisation of this mandate. Okay, so you'd have the Prime Minister and the Minister, depending on who it is, maybe Minister for Health and his government body, ensuring that the logistics around getting vaccinated have been organised. Finally, if someone is unhappy with this law and they feel like maybe it goes against their rights, it's unconstitutional, or they've got another problem with it in relation to it, they may choose to go to the judiciary. Okay, and a judge will then look at that law, that mandated vaccine law, and they'll try and decide whether or not it does go against human rights. Okay, if it does, or they feel like it does, then they may overrule that within court, and that may change the legislation. Okay, so that's kind of how it works, or how they work in conjunction with one another. Okay, so administration of the law, we've got makes the laws, and we've got someone who actually looks and checks to ensure that those laws are deemed okay, appropriate, and constitutional. Okay, now it's important to note here that the judicial power is independent from the rest. And that actually says that in the Constitution. So it's actually completely independent, whereas the executive power and the legislative power are actually combined or work kind of together. So you know that the Prime Minister is actually voted into the House of Reps, but he's also holds executive power to organise things. Okay, so there's actually an overlap between executive and legislative power. So, what is the purpose of having these separate bodies? Well, the idea behind them is that they're supposed to operate as independently as possible, and this is particularly relevant to the High Court, which can deem laws void, and the fact that the legislative can make or override laws made by the High Court or precedent if they like. Okay, the purpose is to ensure that no one body has absolute power over the other, to ensure that our political and legal systems function appropriately for us. Okay, so again, the idea is to prevent too much concentration in the hands of one person and to avoid abuse of power and balances in Parliament. Okay, so it's about maintaining independence in order to protect our individual rights as person. So you can see that the High Court is very much separate from us, but you can see that our Parliament and the executive are more combined. So what does this kind of mean for protection? Well, some of the strengths, I guess, around having a system of checks and balances, some of them include the fact that despite the executive and the legislative overlapping in some instances, there are things in place to check that power, such as question time, which usually occurs on weekdays, 2 p.m., which enables the legislative or the people who have seats in Parliament to actually talk to the senior ministers, question them, and question the government of the day's policies and the way in which they're administering those policies. So there is discussion around what the government of the day is actually doing and the executive is actually doing in terms of that. Another strength is the fact that the judiciary is completely independent of Parliament. So it means that it can review government policies and it can overturn or review unconstitutional matters, which may be made by the legislative or executive. Okay, so it means that someone can go to court if they have a problem with the law and actually get that looked at. Another reason or another way that kind of acts as a check on lawmaking is this idea of the Senate being mixed. It means that most bills will have some sort of discussion before they're passed by the legislative, and this can also stop the executive pushing through an agenda without any scrutiny. The last thing is the separation of powers is entrenched in the Constitution and would require a referendum, a vote by everyone in Australia, to be removed. So this acts as a strong protection as a government of the day can't, stop this check on power or these bodies of power without a referendum. Some of the weaknesses or some of the problems of this as a check, the legislative and executive are actually combined, so it weakens their ability to kind of act as a check on one another, because the administration of the laws is also carried out by the executive who have been voted in the legislative. Another thing is that despite the High Court being independent and the court system being independent, the judges can actually appointed by our executive, which means that if there is a position available, the government of the day could choose a judge that might be more favourable to any decisions or any hearings that may come up against the government's policies. Additionally, if we've got the executive controlling the Senate as well, it means that there's a rubber stamp, which means they can pass legislation very easily, which means there's less scrutiny on the laws being made of the day. And lastly, the Australian Constitution only provides information on federal government or checks and balances at the federal level. So there's nothing to say that at a state level, and we know the states actually have a fair bit of power, that they're actually getting a check from it. So it's problematic in the sense that it doesn't cover all levels of power in Australia. Okay, and that is it today. Thank you very much. I can turn it off.